All right. This is Sharpening Iron Podcast. I am joined here by Colton Carlson. How are you doing, brother?
Doing fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. It's always a
Awesome.
pleasure. Yeah.
Yeah, so I wanted to have you on to explain a couple things. First, what is compatibilism? Secondly, uh, how can this idea of guidance control explain how God determines? I'm basically getting into some of those issues. And then I want to hone in on some of the work that you've been doing in First Corinthians 10:13,
hmm
I believe it is, and how a compatibilist can respond to that type of objection. So, if you don't mind, brother, how do you define compatibilism?
Yeah. Compatibilism has kind of changed. The definition has sort of changed over the years. It's from the classical definition. A lot of people tend to put determinism in there because the actual definition, just ironically enough, is that determinism is compatible with some sort of free will. And so the classic philosophers like Hobart, for instance, or maybe even A.J. Ayer from like 50, 60 years ago, would technically put determinism into that definition. But the technical and most logical definition that we have of compatibilism doesn't entail that. So, compatibilism is just the thesis that determinism is compatible with free will. And whatever free will is and whatever determinism is, it doesn't entail, by definition, determinism or free will. So if I say I'm a compatibilist, that doesn't entail that I also have to believe determinism. Or if I say I'm a compatibilist, it doesn't have to entail that I also at the same time believe that we are free. What it does entail is that if free will is true and if determinism is true at the same time, there is no problem. They can coexist, they are compossible. So that's what that means. And so, usually in theological circles, that gets kind of confused because most uh, most philosophers or theologians who are arguing about these things, specifically if they are a compatibilist, usually they are a determinist at the same time. So, like, usually reformers, Calvinists would say, "Oh, I'm a compatibilist," but then also usually hold to the Westminster Confession or the three forms of unity, like the London Baptists, something like that. So, if that's the case, then they usually do because of the chapter 3 of the Westminster. It's has ordained everything, pretty much, as a
Yeah.
paraphrase. So they're going to affirm determinism as well. But that's in addition to the fact. So um, I always like to say that there's a difference between the application of determinism when you're a compatibilist and the definition of determinism when you're a compatibilist. The definition of determinism is not built into the thesis of compatibilism or the doctrine of compatibilism. It can be added after the fact for application. So, like, if you're a reformer or a Calvinist, usually you will want to be a compatibilist and a determinist at the same time. But you don't have to be. I would say that if you're a reformer and you hold to the three forms of unity and you're not a determinist, then you're probably inconsistent in my mind. But
Yeah.
that's for a whole nother podcast, I guess. But either way, that's the definition of compatibilism, and there is a difference between the definition of compatibilism and its application. The definition doesn't entail determinism or free will, even though most compatibilists would affirm probably
Both.
both. At least the
Yeah.
free will part, like contemporary compatibilists, are almost always going to affirm the free will part and give necessary and sufficient conditions, at least necessary conditions for free will, though they may be skeptical of the determinism part, and that's totally fine. If you're a theological compatibilist, you're probably going to affirm both. I think if you're a theological compatibilist, you probably definitely should affirm free will, because I think that the Bible just exudes free will of the agents. But at the same time, you could technically be skeptical of the determinism part, though most theological compatibilists are going to lean towards determinism. So I myself lean towards determinism because I think it's the best providential model. But technically, I don't know how else to argue for it other than the fact that I think it's the best providential model. And if compatibilism is true, by application, God should just determine the world anyways. So if compatibilism is true and his creatures could be determined, and that is not a threat to their free will, then why wouldn't God determine the whole world in the first place? He can have the best of both worlds. He can have them be free, and then at the same time, he can determine them and have strong providence. Whether that
Yeah.
makes him the author of evil for determining sinful actions is again another question. But and we can go down that route if you want. But at the end of the day, that's the definition. Last, there is in kind of a resurgence in the last decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, this idea of moral responsibility being added into the definition of compatibilism. So some philosophers like Van Inwagen do not like that moral responsibility should be added into that definition of free will. So, specifically compatibilism. So, Van Inwagen says you should not make compatibilism about moral responsibility and determinism. Though many have not heeded his advice over the years, including John Martin Fisher, McKenna, Sartario, Taylor Sear, so even Guillaume
Yeah.
Vignon. So a lot of compatibilists have just not heeded that advice and have just gone full out. Compatibilism is the thesis that moral responsibility and determinism are true. But then there's other varieties, such as John Martin Fisher's famous doctrine called semi-compatibilism. And semi-compatibilism is just the basic thesis of compatibilism, but it says something really interesting. It says moral responsibility and determinism are compatible even if free will and determinism are incompatible. Now,
Yeah.
it's free will, what John Martin Fisher says, he has in mind this idea of the ability to do otherwise. So he says, even if the ability to do otherwise is incompatible with determinism, uh, moral responsibility is compatible with determinism because of what he calls guidance control. So, I mean, there's some nuances there, and you kind of have to follow the literature as you kind of read throughout the decades. My chosen definition is just compatibilism is the thesis that moral responsibility and or free will is compatible with determinism, and then hash out what you mean by free will, whether you mean sourcehood or whether you mean alternative possibilities or access to those possibilities or whatever. So if you want me to expound more on that, I can, but that's the basic
For sure.
definition.
So if someone were to say to you, well, all I have to do is refute determinism to refute compatibilism, would
Right,
you say that's logically erroneous?
right. It's not conceptually correct. It would only be conceptually correct if your interlocutor said that I affirm determinism as a necessary condition for compatibilism. And some theologians like Tim Stratton, I think even Leighton Flowers says that. Others like maybe even Roger Olson, I think, has kind of hinted at that.
Yeah.
Um, Percarelli. So some of those non-Calvinist theologians have even maybe even John Lang, but I'm not sure. They have all hinted at the fact that, oh, if determinism is not true, if indeterminism is true, well then compatibilism is not true. Well, that's not correct because again, compatibilism does not entail determinism by definition. So you refuting determinism does nothing. In other words, you can affirm indeterminism and still be a compatibilist. In fact, Lee Vissens is a contemporary analytic theologian, philosopher, who has published just that in her book in Theological Determinism. I just happen to have this here. Just It's edited by Furlong and Vissens, so she's one of the editors. She has an
Mhm.
amazing chapter in there, an article called "The Inevitability of Sin," and she argues for compatibilist indeterminism. Uh, Augustine is probably another famous compatibilist indeterminism, depending on how you view his late work, but it is conceptually coherent to be a compatibilist indeterminist. So just because you deny or show determinism to be false, that does nothing to affirm um, the negation of compatibilism,
Yeah.
if that helps.
Oh yeah, for sure. So, would you agree with me essentially that it's basically the difference between a conceptual analysis and what I call an affirmative analysis? Instead of affirming that both concepts are true, it's just a conceptual analysis. You're just looking at
Right,
the two views and asking if there's coherence internally.
right.
Can you
Yeah,
have
yeah,
freedom and determinism together? Is that a conceptual possibility? Right.
yeah, yeah. I would affirm that. Yeah,
Okay. Just being just wanted to be clear on that because that's what I told to my brother Kevin. And so if he's watching this, brother, this is in light of you. But yeah, that that was an interesting conversation because you know, he and I, well, he's a provisionist, so he's more on the Leighton Flowers camp in this area.
right,
And so I think a lot of that sort of governs how he thinks about compatibilism.
right,
And so I wanted to get into one of his main critiques, which was specific to how God determines. And so he was basically asking, well, on your model, how is God determining what happens? Is he determining your desires as well? And if he is, how is that not conceptually the same as a puppet master moving the strings, essentially,
right,
on the will in specific? So, how would you answer an objection like that? And could you maybe expound upon the concept of guidance control and how all of that is relevant to this specific topic?
right. So first, the puppet analogy, I don't find any good reason to accept the puppet analogy. I think Guignon Bignon, in his book Excusing Sinners, Blaming God, has an entire chapter on it. It's the shortest chapter because he finds it to be the weakest argument. Go figure. So,
Right.
but the puppet analogy basically says exactly that, that determinism is analogous to God being the puppeteer and you being a puppet. And so what he basically his I'll just kind of summarize his idea about it, why it doesn't work, and then in its place we can put a better model of how determinism ought to function and what it ought to look like. How can we be actually free, not a puppet or a robot or whatever, and God still be the sufficient determiner of what we do. So first the puppet analogy. So uh Bignon, yeah, Bignon, he's great. If anyone's watching this and they haven't read his book and they're interested in the debates regarding free will, Calvinism, moral responsibility, all that stuff, you really have. It doesn't matter if you're non-Calvinist or Calvinist. You have to read that book. It
Yeah.
is like one of the best books, if not the best book on the topic. So in his chapter, he distinguishes between a strong and a weak analogy. So the weak analogy, if I remember correctly, says that there is one relevant similarity between the two things. So in this case, there's one relevant similarity between God determining us and us being the puppet and him being the puppeteer. And then the other analogy, the strong analogy, says that there is no relevant difference. And so the weak analogy, he comes up and basically says that it is just that it's too weak, and it ends up being question begging because what is the relevant similarity? Well, the incompatibilists would say you are determined. So they would just say, oh yeah, in the Calvinist deterministic model, God is determining you to do what you do. And in the puppet model, the puppeteer is determining the puppet to do what they do. So therefore, determination is the one relevant similarity. Well, except for the fact, and the reason why this doesn't work is because absent of an argument as to why that's problematic and why that rules out our free will, we have to be able to say that it's question begging, like it jives with the incompatibilist intuitions. So then Bignon throws that out, and then he goes to the other analogy, and he says, okay, well, what if the incompatibilist presses that there is no relevant difference between God being the puppet master and us being the puppets and the actual puppeteer and the puppets? There's no relevant difference. Well, he basically says that there is a relevant difference that is uncontroversially true for all parties, incompatibilists and compatibilists, and that doesn't beg the question, and that incompatibilists would definitely like see as necessary for free will and moral responsibility. What is that thing? Well, consciousness. Consciousness. So, like, the puppet doesn't have consciousness, whereas in the God and human model, we do have consciousness. Now, a lot of people say, well, that doesn't work because God could determine your own consciousness and blah 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 blah. Yes, but consciousness is still necessary whether you're compatibilist or incompatibilist for free will.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter. And so all Bignon had to do is point to one relevant difference in order to refute the no relevant difference claim. And so what's the relevant difference? Consciousness. And so therefore it refutes the no relevant difference claim. So there's other ways you can go about the puppet argument. Like, for instance, Heath White has an excellent chapter on the meaning of life in his book, his 2019 book, Fate and Free Will. Awesome. Go check it out. Anyone's listening, if you haven't read it, you should read it. But generally, I like Bignon's response to it, and so that's what I use. So if the puppet analogy doesn't work, okay, well then, how are we to look at determinism? Like, what would it mean to say? What would it look like to say God determines everything, and yet at the same time we're free? I like to use a counter analogy, and I like to say the author analogy. So the author analogy has gotten a lot of flack, but I think it can be adequately defended, and then defended really, really well. We can go into the defense if you want to, but generally the author analogy is to say that our relationship with God underneath compatibilism is more like an author than like a computer programmer, right? So it is more like a story. We are in a novel, not coded to do what we do like a robot, or moved like we do like a puppet. So this idea of us living in a novel is actually rather intuitive, because when you think of a famous book like, Lord of the Rings, or, To Kill a Mockingbird, or, Harry Potter, you don't say that the author, Harry Potter for this instance, you don't say that J.K. Rowling is the only agent in the entire book. No, no one says that. So it's like, oh yeah, who killed Voldemort? Oh, J.K. Rowling. Or, who collected all the Horcruxes? Oh, J.K. Rowling collected all the Horcruxes. Who killed? I know I'm doing massive spoilers here, but sorry. You should either read it or watch the movies. Like, honestly, they're more than a decade old. So, who killed Dumbledore on the tower that night? J.K. Rowling, of course. No one says that. No one says that. You're gonna say who killed Dumbledore, right? Snape. Snape killed Dumbledore. Who killed Voldemort? Harry Potter killed Voldemort. But at the same time, you're also going to say, oh, what is the sufficient reason why Snape killed Dumbledore, or why Harry Potter killed Voldemort, or why Hermione is good friends with Ron and Harry, and why Harry ended up with Ginny at the end? Well, J.K. Rowling, of course. So what you'll start to see is that J.K. Rowling is the sufficient reason, or the sufficient cause, the sufficient explanation, and her will explains everything else in the book. But at the same time, you're not going to say that she is the only agent in the book. Of course, there's other agents, just naturally, intuitively. So this model helps us provide a good deterministic model because then you can ask, could Harry do anything other than what J.K. Rowling writes? And the answer is, of course, intuitively, no, right? Whatever J.K. Rowling writes for Harry Potter is what Harry Potter is going to do. But at the same time, in the story, that transcendent story, you're not going to say that Harry Potter doesn't have any agency at all, that he's not a source, he's just a mere puppet to the whims of J.K. Rowling's will. What you're going to say is that he is an agent, he makes friends, he has hard decisions, he deliberates, he fights, and he ultimately kills Voldemort. And the story is a great story. And yet, at the same time, we can say, okay, that's a fantastic analogy for us. We live in that great story, the story of redemption. And all of us, especially the elect, are part of that. And maybe the non elect, but that gets into the weeds. But the idea is this model provides us a good framework for how God could determine us, yet at the same time, we can be the source, not the source, but a source of our actions. So, to use Aristotle's language and the medieval language, God is the efficient source of good action, but we are the formal source. Okay, and
Right.
so in that story, in our story, we are still a source. Now, what could be put even further is, all right, how can I make good free will actions in light of that? Well, then you can take a Frankfurt type example, a common Frankfurt type example that I'm going to assume most people are familiar with. If not, just tell me to explain it. And then I can map it right onto the author analogy.
Yeah, it might be good to explain because while I'm aware of the issues here, I do think there's a lot of people, especially who watch my show, that are unfamiliar with it.
Right.
So I think it might be good to like unpack what that example actually is.
Sure. Yeah. So Frankfurt style argument or counterexample or case goes all the way back from Harry Frankfurt from 1969 in a July article from I think it was the Journal of Philosophy, but very famous article, probably as famous as the Gettier article. It was 10 pages long. Gettier article was 3 pages long, and it really just shaped the entire landscape of free will. And so in that article, Harry Frankfurt argued that, all this time, free will philosophers have actually got it wrong, that you can be free but not have any alternative possibilities or access to them. So at the time, incompatibilism and compatibilism were really much like a what we call leeway debate. Leeway just means that we have access to alternative possibilities. So they viewed free will and moral responsibility in terms of access to alternative possibilities. If you had access to alternative possibilities, you were free. So for the compatibilist, it was a conditional analysis. If I wanted or chose to do otherwise, I would have done otherwise. And for the incompatibilist, it was I am free because I could do otherwise, all things considered. That's what we call the categorical ability.
Yeah.
And Harry Frankfurt comes in and basically just sabotages all of it and says, "No, all of you are wrong. It really is has to do with you being the source of your action. It has nothing to do with leeway. It has everything to do with you being the source." So what he constructed is a variety of different cases where it is almost intuitive that the agent in the scenario couldn't do otherwise but is still at the same time responsible and free for what he does. And if that's the case, well, then you can have free will and moral responsibility without all the drama of alternative access to alternative possibilities. And so it's kind of like opens up this new debate where, like 100 years ago, everyone was kind of stuck around access to alternative possibilities. So that's the kind of history, and this is really big. So the case goes something like this. Imagine three agents, Black, Smith, and Jones. Okay, very creative with his names, I know. Black wants Smith dead, but luckily enough, Jones also wants Smith dead. And so Black, being very cunning, He is a neurosurgeon and very nefarious. Unbeknownst to Jones, when Jones sleeps, he plants a computer chip in his brain to kind of see and analyze exactly all of Jones's brain movements, all of his decisions before he makes them. And so, at any prior time the next day, at any prior sign of Jones doing what he does, Black can read that on his little iPad. So if Jones wants to grab a Coke out of the fridge, Black can see where on his brain the neurons are firing that lead him to grab a Coke out of the fridge. But if Jones wants to say, I don't know, kill Smith, then Black can also see that as well. So when it comes down to the assassination of Smith, uh, Jones has a choice. He could either kill Smith or not kill Smith. But as it turns out, he actually kills Smith. But he did not know, Jones did not know that Black also has the power to basically change and manipulate Jones to kill Smith, even if Jones were to decide to not kill Smith. So, in one pathway, Jones decides to kill Smith, and Black does nothing because why? Black wants Smith dead. And he didn't have to do
Yeah.
anything. He just stands idly by because he sees on his iPad, oh, Jones is about to kill Smith. So I don't need to actually intervene at all. I don't need to manipulate him to kill Smith at all. He decides to kill Smith on his own. And then the other pathway, which is what we call the alternative sequence, that sequence is where Jones decides to not kill Smith. And that is when Black flips the switch, hits the button or whatever, and then Jones kind of like zoop, and then actually goes to kill Smith anyways. So then the idea is you have this actual sequence pathway and then this alternative sequence pathway. But in the Frankfurt style example, how Frankfurt famously writes it, as it happens, Jones decides to kill Smith on his own, and he doesn't actually decide to not kill Smith. Black reads that, doesn't do anything, doesn't flip the switch, doesn't literally manipulate him all. But then the question is Jones morally responsible? And a lot of philosophers, both incompatibilists and compatibilists, have said, yes, he is. He is responsible, even though he couldn't do otherwise. And so the weeds of Frankfurt style cases are just huge. It is an it is a vast understatement to say how big these cases are. Very, very big. I mean, whole books have been written on Frankfurt style cases,
Yeah.
dissertations, numerous, hundreds of articles have been written on Frankfurt style cases. So, depending on how strong you make the case, uh, is is going to depend on how much mileage you can get out of the case. For our purposes, we can say we can make the case as strong as possible for determinism. And if that's the case, let's make the case as strong as possible. And so, how we make that case as strong as possible depends on how you dish out the case. But what my point is it maps onto nicely the author analogy. It maps onto really nicely the author analogy. So we are all living, to kind of put it very bluntly, we are all living in a big Frankfurt style case. Like all of us are. And
Yeah.
we are Jones, and we are all in the actual sequence of events. So, in other words, God is not just flipping this switch on us all the time, like we're robots, or we're not like some chessboard that He's actively moving and we're just kind of passive in the midst. We are active in our decision making, just as Jones was active in his decision making in killing Smith. God, though, is sitting in the wings. Now, it gets even more sticky, and I'll say this briefly and then we can kind of recap. But gets
Sure.
even more sticky specifically for the Christian wanting to do this, because then you have actions that are sinful and actions that are righteous. So then, is God really active when with sin, or is He passive with sin? Is He passive with righteousness when you're doing righteous actions? And so, to me, I would say God is active moving the pieces actively in our lives when it comes to righteous things. So, like, for
Yeah.
instance, sanctification. And everyone should be cheering amen to that because we need God's help to be sanctified,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Of
Mhm.
course. I don't see why any incompatibilist would say this, that, no, I don't want God to help me actively change me to be better sanctified. Like, that's ridiculous. Like, God obviously should be actively helping us, changing our character for us to be more sanctified. But when it comes to sin, it's more like the Frankfurt style case. He's sitting idly by, and he is just almost, in some sense, as Bignon would put it, allowing it to happen. And so he is black in this case. In the actual sequence of events, we choose to sin whatever sin, but we did it on our own decision making, on our own free will. But at the same time, could we have done otherwise? Well, if you map it with a Frankfurt style case, no, you could not have done otherwise. And so
Yeah.
take the Frankfurt style case, the strongest case you possibly can, put it on the author analogy. And I think that is how you can get someone to be free, a source, and yet at the same time, you're not the ultimate source of your actions. God is. I hope that helps.
Oh yeah. That that helps a lot, man. So when it comes to like someone responding to this type of presentation, like this understanding of the Frankfurt style example and things like that,
Right.
how would you respond to someone saying, hypothetically, what if Jones was to choose not to murder or to kill, uh, you know,
Smith.
in the story? Yeah.
So how your first
Hypothetically, um, would that still be the case in that hypothetical example where it's not the case that he decides to do that?
So are you asking what would happen if, in a Frankfurt style example, what happens to the alternative sequence? Is that what you're asking? Like if
Yeah, like,
Jones decides to not kill
yeah.
Smith?
If Jones decides not to do that action and then you know, he decides to flip the chip so
Hmm.
that he does end up killing Smith in the actual sequence,
Right,
but it was against his decision.
right.
Would you say that's what's happening on the compatibilist model? Or would you say that that would just be an hypothetical alternative to the actual sequence, but in the actual sequence, we're doing it volitionally?
Right, right. Great question. It is not what the compatibilist model would look like. The compatibilist model is an actual sequence freedom model. So what it does is it only holding fixed the actual sequence, it only looks at what Jones actually does in the model. And that is in the Frankfurt style example, Jones kills Smith on his own, is the famous words that
Oh,
Frankfurt
yes.
used. And so that generates this idea of sourceness, right? And you can dish out source however which way, but for our purposes, we can just say he does it on his own, and Jones is the source of his action without having any alternative possibilities. Now, when you say, okay, well, there is an alternative sequence, right? Yes, but does he have access to those alternative sequences? So just because there are alternative sequences built into the Frankfurt style example doesn't mean he has access to them. And the issue
Yeah.
is, does he have access? If he has access to those alternative sequences, then indeterminism would be true. That's the garden of forking paths kind of thing, right? But if he doesn't have access to those alternative sequence, or better yet, if having access to alternative sequences is irrelevant to whether or not he is morally responsible, then why introduce them in the first place? Why even focus on them? So even
Right.
if Jones did have access to them, clearly him having access is not necessarily as important as him actually deciding on his own to kill Smith. So
Yeah.
if even if I were to grant that he does have access to alternative possibilities, I would push back and say that him having access to those alternative possibilities is not as relevant to him being the source of his action. Um, it's not as relevant as him choosing on his own to kill Smith. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, yes, incompatibilists have, gone back and forth with Frankfurt style examples, and probably the most famous objection to Frankfurt style examples is the flicker defense. So the flicker defense says, oh yeah, Jones does have a small, weak flicker of freedom that that he could have access to. In other words, when he's in the actual sequence, right before Black switches him to kill Smith, like manipulates him to kill Smith, Jones could theoretically to say, whoa, wait a minute, I don't want to do this. In just an instance of thinking that, that's when Black switches uh, Jones to kill Smith. And so either sequence, it goes back and Jones kills Smith, but that little flicker of him maybe deciding, well, maybe do I want to do this or maybe do I not? Maybe I don't want to do this. And then he gets flipped. That maybe I don't want to do this piece, that deliberation, is what incompatibilists have called the flicker. And so they use that as a strategy to say, oh, no, 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 he is still indeterminate and he still has access to alternative possibilities and blah, blah, blah. We don't necessarily need to get into the weeds if you don't want to, but basically, the most common response is that that flicker there is not robust enough. It's not strong enough to be able to ground responsibility, his responsibility in the actual sequence. So even in the actual sequence, though he does kill Smith on his own, and we can even grant that, yes, I guess he has a weak flicker here that he could decide to kill Smith however which way, maybe this way, that way, or decide to not kill Smith at all. That those alternatives, access to alternatives alone, does not properly ground or explain why he is in fact morally responsible in the actual sequence. So even if we grant that, it's still not a problem. So I hope that answers the question. I don't know if it does, but let me know.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, I was just curious because I'm trying to think of how people could respond to those types of issues. But yeah, I appreciate that. With respect to you were alluding to it there, like sourcehood and things like that.
Mhm.
Could you touch a little bit more on the importance of that on the Calvinistic understanding of God's decree and its relationship to our responsibility?
Yeah, right. So, like I said, there's classic free will philosophers would say that their free will has to do with having a sense of leeway over their actions. So, in the sense of like, I can control whether or not I do this or that. But contemporary philosophers would put more of the weight on um, source. So they would put more of the weight on how I can be the source of my actions. And if I can be the source of my actions, then I can be free. And if free will is a necessary condition for moral responsibility, then um, I can have, I could be morally responsible for it. So, with relation to Calvinism and Reformed theology, yeah, I think that we should have a sense of control over our actions, and whether that's leeway, having access to alternative possibilities, or whether that's being the source of your actions or a source of your actions, that shows us how much control we have. So, kind of backing up, moral responsibility is usually seen as entailing free will. So, free will can be actually defined as the control condition necessary for moral responsibility. That control condition, that freedom relevant condition, can be parsed out in two different categories: free will in the sense of leeway, having access to alternative possibilities, or free will in the sense of being a source of your actions. And so, of course, reformers, Calvinists are going to want to say that we are morally responsible to God, we are held accountable to God. He can attribute negative reactions to us if we don't
Yeah.
follow His commandments and so forth. And we should be able to do that with other Christians and so forth. I think it's very intuitively found in the Bible. And if we are morally responsible, then that entails that we have a sense of freedom over our will. And that entails that we have a sense of control over our will. And so if we think about the Frankfurt style example, put it on top of the author analogy, well, then, okay, we should have then a sense of control over our wills. And that is parsed out through being a source of our actions. So it's very, Calvinists should actually affirm this. Anyone who doesn't affirm this, I would probably chalk them up, to be honest, probably a hyper or like a really super hard Calvinist. But those are minorities and rare. But yeah,
Oh, yeah.
it's very it's. I think any Calvinist should affirm free will, and whether or not they affirm determinism, they should affirm that we are a source of our actions.
For sure. But how would you answer the objection specifically with respect to our nature and our desires? A lot of objections I typically hear are like, well, yeah, you may be doing what you want to do,
Right,
but why do you want to do what you do?
right,
Is it because of God's decree? And if it is, then doesn't that seem to entail for them that God is somehow maliciously involved in the action?
right. Yeah, so there's the maliciously involved in the action is a sort of separate question. But I hear the objection all the time, but usually what I would say is that is a separate question to whether or not we are free. We could be completely free, and God could be completely blameworthy for every single thing. Or
Yeah.
we can be completely free, and God can be blameworthy for some things and not all things, or God can be completely blameless. Hence Bignon's book, excusing sinners, comma, blaming God. So he's trying to defend against the fact that if determinism were true, Calvinist determinism were true, that would somehow excuse sinners. But the other half of the book would be if Calvinistic determinism were true, that would somehow put blame on God. So he defends against those common objections. So focusing then solely on the excusing part, the free will part, if God determines all things, even how you desire what you desire, does that somehow make you unfree, regardless of whether or not it loops back to God? And well, I guess what I would say is that sort of free will and desires kind of cuddle puddle there is kind of outdated. So the last major theologian, to my mind, that would argue that you are free to do what you desire, and that freedom is cashed out in your desire to do what you do, is really Jonathan Edwards. He was like probably the biggest proponent of something like this.
Yeah.
And honestly, during that time, it was ingenious. So anyone who is going against that should just pause and say, regardless if you're a Calvinist or not, that's ingenious. But of course, as philosophy moves on, you start seeing holes in it and everything like that. First, the if even if I were to say that that compatibilism is in terms of like free will, is in terms of how we respond to our desires. It's like if I desire this, if I wanted to do this, then I would. That's the leeway version, the conditional ability. Even if I were to say that doesn't commit me to determinism. So saying, well, doesn't God determine that to you? Who cares? Like I'm not affirming determinism unless the interlocutor actually says, I also at the same time affirm determinism. then it may be an issue. But that that retort to me is irrelevant because it doesn't matter whether or not God determined it. All I'm saying is free will, in some sense, is related to the desires of our actions, or vice versa, whatever. That's the first thing I would say. Secondly, it is outdated, and I would never actually use free will in terms of desires. I would use free will in terms of the contemporary scholarship, which is uh, reasons responsiveness. So, just like Jones is responsive to reasons in the Frankfurt style example. He's responsive to reasons in the Frankfurt style example. He deliberates, he sees reasons for killing Smith, and ultimately in the actual sequence, he finds those reasons very compelling, and then he does what he does. He kills Smith for his own reasons. And so, cashed out, free will cashed out in terms of reasons responsiveness makes even more intuitive sense than it does with desires and wants. And so anyone pressing that objection, I would say, right, okay, but that's old. Let's kind of steelman compatibilism here. Let's put free will in terms of reasons responsiveness and say, okay, I am reasons responsive, even though God can determine me to do what I do. Now, of course, the incompatibilist could say, well, doesn't God determine your reasons to do what you do? Right, but it's still compatible. It's like me being responsive to reasons, reactive to them, recognizing those reasons. That is all compatible. And within my dispositional environment, that is all compatible with God determining me to do what I do. So the retort really is this: well, isn't God determining you to have those reasons? Yes, but not determining a reason that's not conclusive with the evidence around me. To give you an example, let's just say I believe in determinism. Let's just say I believe in compatibilism, which I do. But can God determine me and to believe an elephant is in this room right now, in the room with me? He could, but I think it would be a violation of reason. Why? Because I have literally no reason to believe, because I'm not insane. I have no reason to believe, no evidence to suggest that there is an elephant in this room right now. So God determines us through a reasons responsive mechanism. So he determines me to believe what I believe and to think what I think and to act how I act because I have reasons to act how I act. I have reasons to decide what I decide. And those reasons are structured around the objective dispositional environment in which I find myself in. I find myself in my office. There's no way an elephant could fit in this room. I've never seen an elephant here before. I'm giving all these reasons for why it would be illogical to believe that there's an elephant in this room. And God can certainly determine all of those reasons, but those reasons are guided by the evidence. So to me, God could determine me to believe that there's an elephant in this room, but it would be absolutely irrational given the state of my mind, given I'm mentally healthy, given the fact that I have no other reasons to believe that there is no reason at all to believe that there's an elephant in this room. I am reasons responsive in that sense. And
Yeah.
because of that, I am free to believe that there's not an elephant in this room. All the while, God can determine all of that. So God determines through a reasons responsive mechanism. Let's go back to the Frankfurt style example. He does it with Jones, right? Jones does what he does because of his own reasons, right? Although he couldn't do otherwise. That's compatible with determinism. And then put it back onto J.K. Rowling and the author analogy. Harry Potter kills Voldemort for his own reasons, for his own agential, deliberative reasons. His evidence to say, I need to kill Voldemort now. But at the same time, he couldn't do otherwise because J.K. Rowling was the ultimate and efficient source of that, or at least the sufficient source of that. Does that answer the question, maybe?
Yeah. And I really appreciate that, man. But How about First Corinthians? I think that would be a good way to divert into that topic specifically because there are a lot of objections saying that First Corinthians 10:13, I believe it is,
Mhm.
that text seems to indicate that we have some sort of libertarian freedom,
Right.
right? So if you would want to, brother, uh, do you want to read the text and then maybe give your own response to that objection?
So the text, I'm just going to read it basically from the ESV because it doesn't matter. But
Sure.
no temptation is taken over you that is not common to man. But God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but will, with the temptation, also provide a way of escape so that you may be able to endure it. So the idea, the two key phrases here, what the libertarian often utilizes is beyond your ability and way of escape. So what that means is that the libertarian usually, not all libertarians, but some perhaps laymen, online libertarians, and some academic like William Lane Craig, Tim Stratton, Kochi, David Kochi from the 90s, and then Paul Himes have all published on the fact that yes, First Corinthians 10:13 teaches libertarian freedom because of this idea of way of escape. Like you could either resist the temptation or you could succumb to the temptation. So you have this kind of garden of forking paths, kind of like what libertarian free will seems to espouse. There's a plethora of problems with that. I will try to minimize some of the more basic ones, and then if you allow, I can try to go through what I'm researching currently right now
As
on.
much as you want, brother. I
All right.
got all the time, and I'm probably a lot more interested than the listeners right now. So I'm more than willing to get into this with you, brother.
Yeah, so First Corinthians 10:13, the issue with this entailing libertarian free will, because that's what they say. They don't just say that it's compatible with libertarian free will. They say it entails it, it teaches it, which is super strong. That's a super strong text to say that. Here's the problem. The first problem is, at best, it entails indeterminism. So even if I were to grant that the way of escape literally means metaphysical access, that's what Paul had in mind when he wrote the text, metaphysical access to resist temptation or to succumb to temptation. Even if I were to grant that that actually does mean the categorical ability and the way the libertarian suggests that I have access to this and to that, the very best, that entails indeterminism, not libertarianism. And so then they're like, well, why? Indeterminism doesn't entail libertarianism. By definition, libertarian freedom entails three things. It entails free will. However you parse out free will, either sourcehood or alternative possibility, access to alternatives, which most libertarians are going to say access to alternatives, and then sourcehood just kind of comes along for the ride.
Yeah.
Then they're going to say incompatibilism. So free will has to be incompatible with determinism, of course. But then because of that, they're going to say indeterminism. Indeterminism has to be true. It has to be true. So determinism has to be false. Those are the main basic three conditions for libertarian freedom: free will, indeterminism has to be true, so therefore determinism has to be false, and incompatibilism has to be true. So all those things. Because remember, incompatibilism could be true, and yet determinism could also be true because incompatibilism doesn't say whether or not determinism or free will are in fact true. So like Dirk Pereboom would lean towards determinism and yet still say he's an incompatibilist. So
Yeah.
you need to have all three of those conditions to be a libertarian. So if you say that First Corinthians 10:13 entails libertarian free will, what you're saying is that it entails free will, indeterminism, and incompatibilism. So how does that even work? So you're trying to jam pack three conditions into what? A way of escape? It's ridiculous to me. Even now, let's be charitable. Let's say, okay, let's say they're right. It does entail indeterminism. And that indeterminism, it does entail free will as well. Well, then I think the type of free will that it is entailed has to be, by definition, incompatible with determinism, because they're going to say that that free will is the categorical ability, the ability to choose all things considered, to resist temptation or to not resist temptation. So, if that's the case, they're going to be able to say, all right, that kind of categorical ability, by definition, is incompatible with determinism. So then, all right, it seems like we got all three, right? It seems like we got indeterminism because I could do this or to do that, resist or not resist. It seems that I have free will to resist or not resist, the categorical ability. And that categorical ability, by definition, entails incompatibilism, because you can't have the categorical ability and still be determined, because it's the categorical ability.
Yeah.
So then it seems like you have all three. Does that save the verse? No. And here's why. Because then you still have monster luck problems. Luck problems. The main problem regarding libertarian freedom is luck. So indeterminism. What they're basically counting on is the fact that indeterminism alone kind of provides this sort of foundation for all the other conditions. It's like indeterminism, then free will, and then incompatibilism comes along for the ride. The problem with that is indeterminism, by definition, just can't entail free will because of luck. Now, the libertarian could say, well, there is no luck problem because of this. Kane, famous libertarian, has argued against the luck problem. Tempe, Lemos, O'Connor, Van Inwagen-ish, in some sense. Like, all of these libertarians maybe have defended against the luck problem. Okay, Goats even. So if that's the case, then hey, libertarian freedom is entailed by 1 Corinthians 10:13. Well, even if I were to grant that there is no luck problem, it still does not negate the fact that there is a luck problem, like, that's present because of indeterminism. So in other words, the dialectic looks something like this. 1 Corinthians 10:13, indeterminism is entailed by it, is what the libertarian says. Luck problems, and then the libertarian has to say luck is not a problem, so therefore then they go back to indeterminism. But then let's just think about prima facie the verse. Do you honestly think Paul is saying that?
Yeah, it's a
You
really
honestly,
huge stretch.
yeah, do you honestly think he has all of that in mind? It's just wild. So let's grant even further. I'm granting libertarians so much right now. Let's grant even further. The conceptual problem of indeterminism isn't true, that it entails all three conditions, and that luck, as traditionally understood, isn't a problem. Does it still salvage libertarian freedom from 1 Corinthians 10:13? No. And here's why. Because of what's commonly called the will setting objection. So the will setting objection is actually, to me, in my mind, popularized by Paul Manata. So Paul Manata is, if no one knows who Paul Manata is, you have to. He is an awesome philosopher. He doesn't publish in philosophy really. Like, he has publications, but he doesn't actively publish. But he basically knows everything there is to know about Reformed theology and free will. And he's written an unpublished article that's on his website. Just Google his name, 1 Corinthians 10:13, Paul Manata. You'll be able to get the PDF. It's really nice, on his website. And it's called 1 Corinthians 10:13 and the will setting objection. Basically, he argues that the best libertarian theories involve what we call will setting. And that will setting is itself incompatible with 1 Corinthians 10:13. So then he's like, even if I were to grant the libertarian interpretation, the very best libertarian theories are incompatible with the verse, which is even more crazy. So to kind of break down this idea called will setting objection, it's this idea, it's best seen as like a drunk driver. Okay. Let's just say Jones just to use the same dude, Jones is late after work at a bar. He decides to get drunk. He makes that decision. He's drunk. He gets in the car. He drinks and drives, and he kills a kid on the side of the road, a pedestrian. Could he have, given his alcohol, like he's just stone cold wasted, given his alcohol level and the amount of alcohol he has drank, could he have done other than kill the kid at that time? Well, of course not. Like he was so drunk that he couldn't. He had no control over his steering wheel. He had to kill the kid. Do we say that he's not morally responsible there? Because as a libertarian, you would say, oh, he couldn't do otherwise, right? He's not morally responsible. No, what the libertarian should say is that he is morally responsible, not because of this derivative event, but because of a non-derivative event, an event that was not derived by anything else. Him choosing to get drunk at the bar.
Right.
So that choice, the libertarian would say, is a free will choice. And then the choice of him getting in the car is a free will choice. But then him actually driving, not being able to steer the steering wheel, not being able to control the car, killing the kid as a result, even though that isn't a free will choice there, it is derivative of a free will choice of him choosing to get drunk and getting in the car. So then,
Yeah.
because of that, we can go backwards and say, yes, that choice of him killing a kid is actually free, and he is incompatibilistically free. He is still libertarianly free at that moment, even though he couldn't do otherwise. Okay, so in that instance, he set his will to do that in some vague, way, right? All right. Is there a scenario where you don't that's not involving alcohol? Yes. And let's just say I set my will in such a way through sanctification and everything to just, um, let's just say it's impossible for me to torture my daughter for a nickel. So maybe I was a terrible person before I was a believer, and then God's grace, He saved me, and now I have a kid. And this is not me. I'm just saying. 'Cause I actually love my daughter. I would never
Hypothetical.
touch her.
It's okay.
But yeah, so just want to say that I'm not a horrible human being. I am, but not in the sense that
I
I would
understand.
I would torture my daughter for a nickel. I set my will in this case so that if someone offered me a nickel or any amount of money really to torture my daughter, I would deny it. I wouldn't even think about it. I wouldn't even have the temptation to accept it. I would set my will. You kind of see the similarities here now. So in
Yeah.
this case, the basic standard response of 1 Corinthians 10:13 says, okay, you need indeterminism, right? To resist and not resist. But then the will setting objection comes to, okay, but libertarian theory says that you can be such that you can make free will decisions at non derivative events, such that in later future derivative events, you don't even choose really. You just make the choice habitually to do what you do. If someone quits smoking and then just um, and was really tempted by smoking 10 years ago, but now they don't even have a thought. If someone offers them a cigarette, nope, I'm not going to smoke. Right? What did they do? They set their will through sanctification such that they will not smoke. They're not even tempted by it anymore. They don't even have this temptation saying, "Do you want to smoke or do you not want to smoke?" They don't even think about it. They just say, "I'm not going to smoke." And so what Paul Manata does is he uses this kind of libertarian theory because it is a libertarian theory, very famous one from the works of Robert Kane and Kevin Tempe and others. It basically says this is the best libertarian theory that is really on offer. And you're saying, basically on the standard response to 1 Corinthians 10:13, you're saying that even if you set your will to say that I'm not going to smoke, you have to have an indeterministic access to alternative possibilities to smoke and not to smoke. Crazy, wild, right? Of course, it doesn't make sense. So what Paul Manata is saying is what they should do, the libertarians should do, is dwindle it down. Not saying that you should be able to resist temptation for all temptations, but only for non-derivative, non-set will temptations, right? That's
Yeah.
what they really should say. But then they don't say that. So then it's still critique. It's not like a rebuttal, really. It's not like a defeater, like an undercutting defeater. It's more like just a small rebuttal, if that makes sense. And
For sure.
so I think that maneuver is brilliant. Honestly, I think the brilliancy of it is that you can affirm the libertarian theory and still say the standard model of how you interpret 1 Corinthians 10:13 just doesn't work. And then when you take the will setting model and even try to map it back onto the 1 Corinthians 10:13 verse, then it gets even more muddied because then you're trying to say, oh, Paul only means non-derivative events where you don't set your will. But when you set your will, you don't need the way of escape. I mean, again, is Paul really teaching all of that metaphysical baggage? Probably not. Probably not. And so, if that's the
Yeah.
case, then we really have a good response against the libertarian. And before I move on to my own personal objections, I get this all the time. You probably do too, or at least heard of it.
Yeah.
But how is the determinist supposed to accept the verse? If we put a deterministic reading into the verse, that doesn't make sense. So let's take the lesser of two evils. Just because I critique a libertarian interpretation doesn't mean I have to accept a deterministic metaphysical reading. Why can't I just be agnostic with regards to metaphysical interpretations and just say, hey, Paul meant that as a promise to believers, as an encouragement that, hey, God is with you, He is faithful, and He'll be with you into temptation, and He'll help you actually overcome it. What a great encouragement. No metaphysics involved. So,
Great. We
right?
can just go with Paul.
Well, I get that all the time. Like, oh, if the libertarian interpretation isn't true, well, then the deterministic interpretation isn't much better. I don't need to have a deterministic interpretation in order to say that your interpretation is not up to par. Right? I can
Yeah.
critique your interpretation all the while and still not say that it should be interpreted compatibilistically or deterministically. It's it's irrelevant with regards to the metaphysics debate. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting because this is something I have noticed in these conversations, especially when it comes to exegesis, like trying to go through the biblical passages. One of the things I see very often is some folks seem to think that you have to have every text talk about every topic. And if it doesn't, then those views are false. Warren does this sometimes where he goes, well, it doesn't say Judas was determined to betray Jesus. So determinism is false. It doesn't say Paul was determined to walk down
Yeah,
Damascus Road. So determinism is false.
right,
And just a lot of objections like that. And I think that's what's happening there. Well, if it doesn't say that they were determined in this text,
right,
then how could you understand this deterministically? Well, you don't have to understand it deterministically because it's not even talking in those categories.
right.
The passage isn't even talking about it. And so for me, that's my typical response to the First Corinthians passage. It's not even talking in those categories. So
Yeah,
to try to extrapolate from the text something that it's not about is inappropriate as Christians. We shouldn't do that.
right. And I would wholeheartedly agree. Uh, and so I actually really, when I'm talking to somebody about the First Corinthians 10:13 passage, I really start with that. I didn't start with it this time, but I really start with that because I think it's very, very important to say that. But then I am so, I guess, so gracious and kind that I grant them all these things. So, like I just go through like, okay, let's kind of weigh it, right? Let's put it up to snuff. Let's weigh it out. If if we ought to interpret the verse like you say, then what does that entail? This. That doesn't work. Okay, what about if we interpret the verse and make it better in this format? Libertarianly, does that help the verse? No, it doesn't help. Okay, let's do this. That doesn't help. Let's do this. I mean, I'm just trying to show that any maneuver that the libertarian tries to take to salvage this verse is just it doesn't work. And so I really honestly, kind of being transparent here, I'm just flabbergasted the more I study the verse and the more I study the debate about the verse, the metaphysics debate about the verse, I'm just like, why on earth are they so dogmatic? Why are libertarians so dogmatic about this verse? And I think it really does come from a confusion of indeterminism and libertarian free will, like the one that I explained. Like they honestly think that if indeterminism were true, libertarian freedom is just entailed by it. And that's not true because of luck problems. And because that's not what the definition of indeterminism means, right? Because you still need
Yeah,
free will and incompatibilism and yada yada.
exactly. And that's also going back to like the definition thing I was talking to you about earlier. A lot of people just wrongly define these terms,
Right.
and because of that, it brings a lot of confusion, and sometimes it can be a little bit difficult with totally depraved, you know,
Right.
individuals as to get out of those misconceptions and things like that. But
Right.
yeah, I think you made a really good point with respect to like how we handle the text and things like that, because you know that's why my encouragement to a lot of non-reform folks is to not be dogmatic on specific texts like that,
Hmm.
because I don't think libertarianism stands or falls on that text,
Right.
right? And it's not like you don't have to die on that hill.
Right.
And so for me, I'm just like, you don't have to do that. You can just say, well, it could be, but let's look at the overall picture and see if we can get somewhere from that point. I think
Right.
that'd be more fruitful. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I completely agree. I usually say that, again, this is the one option where we say libertarian free will is entailed by the verse. But the other option is really that libertarian free will is compatible with the verse. But the problem with that is if a compatibilist conception of free will is also compatible with the verse, well, then it literally doesn't matter. So
yeah,
it doesn't matter whether or not the verse is compatible with libertarian free will. It's also compatible with compatibilist free will. So you really can't get any application one way or another out of it. I've also heard people say, well, it's the best interpretation we got. I'm like, no, it's not. How about just the plain pastoral interpretation? Wouldn't that be great without any sort of metaphysical baggage? But yeah, I hear you. Um, yeah, I think that that's good advice, just in general, especially to reformers. Like, I'm very agnostic with regards to the biblical data, and I don't think that the biblical data, especially since it isn't a philosophical textbook and it doesn't speak on metaphysics per se. So extrapolating determinism or indeterminism from certain texts just seems sort of exegetically odd. It seems really like eisegesis to me.
yeah, for sure. And that's why for me, I like to take a step back and ask the question, you know, how are we supposed to understand God's foreknowledge and how we view his omniscience in light of the fact that he created, right?
Mhm.
And so one of the things that I've brought up is like, well, if God knows what will happen when he creates the world the way that he does,
Hmm.
then does that not seem to indicate that by him choosing to create that world, he is determining all the things that will happen in time?
Right.
Because that consequent, he knows what will happen from the action. Him taking the action just determines those truth values, and
Right.
those things will be true in the actual world.
Right.
And so that's how I typically try to approach it. Like, take a step back. Wait a minute. Foreknowledge doesn't help you here because God actually created.
Hmm.
And so, God knowing and acting upon that foreknowledge to create this world, how do you make that conceptually different than a form of determinism? It may not be Calvinistic determinism, but it's a form of determinism. I don't know how you can escape that because all of those things flow from his creation. God has
Right.
created this world, and everything he knows will happen from that creation will happen in that creation.
Right.
So
Right.
that's just the way that I approach it. I don't know what you think about that, but
No, I actually agree. Like it's really called, your version is just um I guess like a smaller version of the creation argument. So Heath White has in his book, like I mentioned, Fate and Free Will. It was published in 2019 by Notre Dame Press, and you can find it like on Amazon. Fantastic book. And then he actually argues that exact same thing. Based off creation, he does determine the truth value of it. Obviously, it's more nuanced, right? It's more
yeah,
nuanced than what you were saying or than what I'm saying, but it is to me, it is a very satisfying argument. I don't know if I would necessarily use it to defend, like, that is the argument for determinism per se. I'm more
yeah,
of like, cheekily, I am more of a determinist for theological reasons than philosophical,
yeah,
because of Westminster and everything. I'm going to defend compatibilism more philosophically. But I like that argument. It's a good argument, I think, and I haven't found reasons to go against it. I also just find the inevitability of sin to be a good argument for determinism, like original sin, which is not just a Calvinist thing. Like non-Calvinists also affirm original sin. Not all non-Calvinists, of course, like provisionists or something, but like
yeah,
or maybe Eastern Orthodox, but generally, like Roman Catholics usually affirm a form of original sin. Um, Methodists affirm it, Lutherans. So, I mean, it's not even some Arminian camps affirm a doctrine of original sin. How you parse it out, to me, that is a good argument for if you can be responsible for something that was not of your not within your control, like original sin. You getting original sin as an infant is not in your control, but yet you're responsible for it and responsible for the consequences of it. And so, if that's the case, well, then it kind of demotivates this idea that if determinism were true, then I can't be responsible because determinism means that things beyond my control affect what I do and determine what I do. Well, so does original sin. So,
yeah. I have a question concerning that because one thing that I've encountered is like the Achan example in scripture where you have that federal headship idea sort of coming out, and Achan sinned, and then him and his household were held accountable for it. Right? It was also his children who were killed for his sin.
right.
So would you say that we could use that as an example from scripture where you have someone actually being held accountable, morally speaking, for someone else's sin, that is Achan, being an example of what we're talking about with respect to, I'm losing my train of thought here, but I
Mhm.
think you get my point. Uh,
Right.
could we use that as an example, like to give an example of where this has happened?
Maybe. I would have to reread the passage again, but at
Mm.
first glance, I think maybe maybe for physical, like you can be physically, like you can be held responsible in the physical sense, but
Yeah,
perhaps the libertarian would, because you die, like they died, obviously, right? So because
yeah,
of Aiken's sin, like like they're responsible for the punishment, like the physically, like ending their life. And I think we see this true in just in our lives, regardless of how you look at Adam and original sin. We now have physical death because of what happened in the garden, and so we technically are reaping the consequences from no choice of our own. Like I didn't choose that, right? And through no
yeah,
choice of our own, we're reaping the consequences of it. So we are, in some sense, held at least physically accountable bi- uh, by factors, for taking responsibility by factors beyond our control, for just living. But the issue is, are we held morally accountable for it?
right,
I'm not sure. I think a libertarian could say that we could possibly be held. We were not like his household was not morally accountable for his own sin, but they were physically accountable, and so they all died, but God's not technically blaming them for his sin, because moral accountability would mean it would entail a reactive attitudes, so like God perhaps blaming, being indignant towards them. So maybe he was only holding him, the head of the household, Achan, morally accountable, but he was only holding everyone else as physically accountable. That's like my first off the cuff.
yeah. And then I'd be like, well, maybe, but if you read the story, I think a little bit more carefully, I think you could make a case that the reason that they are included is due to that federal headship idea, that the guilt is transferred to the the offspring,
Mhm.
and that's the reason they can be included in that physical you know punishment. But yeah, I don't remember the specific text. I'd have to get back to you
Right.
on that. But
Yeah, I'd have to look at it too. I think my first off the cuff would be, yeah, they at least are physically guilty and racially guilty for just being part of the same human race and part of, his family household. But to
yeah,
say that they're therefore morally guilty, even if we adopt the federal headship model, I would have to see an argument for. Now, I still think though it's still a blow because they're still receiving consequences for something beyond their control.
yeah,
And so it's not like it doesn't do any work. It may not do all the work the Calvinist determinist wants them to do, but wants the story to do, but does substantial work. I think like you would still have to say that you can be affected by things beyond your control, by someone else's decisions beyond your control, and there's nothing you can do about that. And that may seem wrong for the libertarian, but then that gives some sort of foothold, I think, for the compatibilist who would argue for determinism in there. So
absolutely. Yeah, I
yeah,
appreciate that because that is something I've been thinking about in light of, rereading the Bible again. I came across that and I was like,
yeah,
um, incompatibilists, what do you do with this? But I haven't really heard a good response to it as far as I can tell. The only thing that I've really heard in response to the Achan example is, well, you can't interpret it that way because Ezekiel says, uh, God has no, you. It might not be Ezekiel, but someplace it says you cannot be held accountable for your parents' sin or something like that,
Right.
for the sin of your father or something.
Yes.
And they'll say, well, therefore, it just can't mean that. But I still haven't actually heard what does it actually teach? What is it trying to convey in that story?
Right.
So for me, I'm just like, I do think that's an issue worth considering at some point. But yeah, brother, I really appreciate you for coming on, man. I really, really do. And I hope to have you on again because I would love for you to look through the video that I was on with my brother Kevin on
Yeah.
this issue and get your thoughts on it because it was slightly frustrating for me. And I'm interested to hear how you would respond and maybe some ways that I can sharpen my arguments in there.
Right.
But yeah, I really appreciate you for coming on, brother. And thank you so much, man.
Yeah. So I wouldn't mind coming back on again. In fact, with regards to like First Corinthians 10:13, I talked a little bit about luck, but we don't have to get into it at all right now. But unless you want to, but it's just there is a difference between and just kind of blank. I didn't say this, but I wanted to say it. But
Sure.
there is a difference between just luck and then moral luck. So then, how I personally respond to after all of that kind of stuff that we talked about in First Corinthians 10:13, I would go further and I would say that they have moral luck problems with regards to like the very first temptations that a believer comes into. So, like, let's just say you're a brand new believer and you have your first temptation as a brand new believer, you will experience what's called constitutive moral luck, and that affects your moral responsibility. And if that's the case, then, long story short, it opens up the doors or at least weakens strongly the intuition that libertarian freedom is entailed by 1 Corinthians 10:13. So I should actually finish that paper probably this month, next month, perhaps. So I wouldn't
I'm
be,
looking forward to it.
yeah, I wouldn't mind coming back on if you would have me, talk more about that, go through the video. It completely up to you. Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to it, man, because I've watched that video back several times and quite honestly, it's kind of hard for me because, I love Brother Kevin, but wow, that was kind of rough. But I wanted to go through it with you because I know that you have uh, a lot more knowledge in these areas than I do. But yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to it, man. But
Yeah.
thank you for coming on, man. I really appreciate it, and I hope the users. I hope the listeners really enjoyed this as much as I did because it's really helping me to sharpen, and that's the whole point of this podcast to sharpen each other to that Proverbs 27 passage,
Mhm.
sharpen one another as iron sharpens iron. So
Right.
may God be glorified and Soli Deo Gloria.